Part 1. The Wrong Accusation. The fog never truly lifted from Blackridge. It clung to the cobblestone streets and choked the narrow alleys, curling around the dim glow of gas lamps like ghostly fingers. On nights when the moon hid behind heavy clouds, the town became a place where sound died quickly, and shadows seemed to lean closer to anyone foolish enough to wander alone. Daniel Cross had lived all his 32 years here in a modest two-story building on Wren Street. By day, he worked in his tiny watchmaker's shop, the air inside perpetually scented with brass shavings and clock oil. His hands were steady, his speech few, and his customers often remarked that Daniel could mend a broken timepiece as though coaxing life back into something that had already given up. He lived simply. No wife, no children, no debts, no quarrels. In a town where gossip was as thick as the fog, Daniel's name rarely came up, and when it did, it was usually with a shrug. But that perhaps was his mistake. In a place like Blackridge, anonymity could turn into suspicion the moment something went wrong. On the night it happened, rain was falling in a slow, ceaseless drizzle. Daniel had stayed in his shop later than usual, bent over the disassembled guts of a grandfather clock whose owner swore it hadn't chimed in a decade. The world beyond his windows was a blurred wash of lantern light and shadow. At one point, he thought he heard shouting from somewhere down the street, but dismissed it as the drunken arguments that often rose from the tavern at the corner. It wasn't until he stepped outside, locking up for the night, that he saw movement across the road. The merchant's shop, a place of fine silks and imported goods run by a man named Harold Sutton, stood with its door slightly ajar. Sutton was known for his wealth, his arrogance, and his dislike of Daniel, though the reason for that dislike was unclear. Daniel hesitated, peering through the rain. There was no light inside, and then came the scream. It was not the startled yelp of someone surprised, but the sharp, tearing sound of mortal fear. It echoed once, twice before being swallowed by the rain. Daniel froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. Before he could move toward the sound, a figure burst from the shop, tall, broad-shouldered, his face hidden beneath a soaked black hood. The man ran in the opposite direction, vanishing into the fog. Daniel stood rooted for a moment before crossing the street. The air inside Sutton's shop was heavy with the metallic tang of blood. Harold Sutton lay sprawled on the floor, his silk waistcoat blooming with a dark, wet stain. His eyes stared blankly at the ceiling, his mouth open in a final gasp that had never been drawn. Daniel knelt beside him without thinking. His fingers brushed Sutton's neck, searching for a pulse that was not there. Rainwater dripped from his hair onto the corpse. That was when the door creaked again. A figure stood in the doorway, Barnaby Holt, a local beggar with a perpetually drunken sway. His eyes widened, his mouth falling open as he took in the sight of Daniel crouched over the body, his hands stained red in the flickering lamplight. "God save us," Holt muttered, before turning and stumbling away into the fog. By morning, the story had grown teeth. The town woke to whispers that Daniel Cross had been caught red-handed. Barnaby Holt had told anyone who would listen that he had seen Daniel slit Sutton's throat and rob him. No one questioned how Holt could have seen such a thing from the street in the rain, or why Daniel, a man with no history of violence, would suddenly commit murder. The sheriff, Edwin Kane, came for him at midday. Kane was a tall, sharp-featured man with eyes like burnt coal. He spoke little, but there was always a shadow of calculation in his gaze, as though he weighed every person he met like merchandise on a scale. They found Daniel in his shop, polishing the brass casing of a pocket watch. He offered no resistance when they bound his wrists. "I didn't kill Sutton," Daniel said evenly. "I'm sure you didn't." Well, Kane replied, his tone flat, but there was no warmth in the words, only the faint curl of something that might have been amusement. The interrogation was brief and pointless. Daniel told them about the hooded figure, about the scream, about finding Sutton already dead. Kane listened without interrupting, then leaned back in his chair. "And yet," the sheriff said slowly, "you were found with blood on your hands, at the scene, with no one else in sight." "The blood was his," Daniel said. "I checked his pulse." "Of course." Kane's lips twitched, but it was not a smile. The trial, if it could be called that, lasted less than 2 hours. Holt testified in a slurred voice that Daniel had been the only man in the shop, knife in hand. The coroner's report, read by the town magistrate, stated the murder weapon was never found, but suggested Daniel had disposed of it in the river before the alarm was raised. No defense witness spoke for him. Those who had once nodded politely in the street now avoided his eyes. The verdict was inevitable. Daniel Cross, the magistrate intoned, you are hereby sentenced to death by hanging. The execution shall take place at dawn, 3 days hence. That night, alone in his damp cell, Daniel sat on the narrow cot, staring at the stone wall. His mind did not race, his breathing did not quicken. He felt instead an eerie stillness, as though a clock inside him had wound down to its final tick, and in the silence that followed, something else had begun to stir. He thought of the hooded man, of Holt's drunken lies, and of the cold gleam in Sheriff Kane's eyes when he said, I'm sure you didn't. Outside, the fog rolled in thick against the prison walls, muffling the world. Somewhere beyond it, a truth waited, and when it came, it would not save Daniel. It would damn everyone else. Part 2. Blood-cold betrayal. The days that followed were not measured in hours, but in the rhythm of footsteps outside Daniel's cell. Each morning the guards clanked down the corridor, their boots grinding against stone, bringing stale bread and cloudy water. Each evening they passed again, sometimes lingering to glance in at the condemned man who, to their confusion, never begged, never shouted, never cursed his fate. The air inside the cell was thick with damp, and a faint drip echoed from somewhere far down the hall, marking time in slow, uneven beats. Daniel sat mostly in the same place, his back against the wall, eyes fixed on nothing. But within, his mind was awake, sharper than it had ever been. He replayed the night of Sutton's murder over and over, sifting every detail. The hooded figure's stride, the angle of the scream, the faint smell of cigar smoke lingering in the shop, all pieces of a puzzle the town refused to see. And behind it all, one name kept surfacing: Victor Hale. Victor was a man of quiet terror in Blackridge. He owned nothing on paper, yet controlled debts, businesses, and even a few key officials. His power was like the fog, unseen but suffocating. Daniel had repaired a pocket watch for him once years ago, and the memory was not pleasant. Hale had smiled with the softness of a blade's edge, speaking with that deliberate calm of a man who believed the world was already his. On the second night before his execution, the cell door opened without the usual rattle of keys. A figure stepped inside, a woman, cloaked in gray. For a moment Daniel thought it a dream, until the hood fell back and he saw Clara Whitmore. She looked pale, her dark hair damp from the night air, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the folds of her cloak. Clara had been his friend since childhood, the only person in Blackridge with whom he had ever truly shared more than a polite nod. Daniel, she whispered, glancing toward the door, I shouldn't be here. They wouldn't let me in if they knew. Why are you here, Clara? His voice was calm, though his eyes searched hers, her gaze dropped. I know who killed Harold Sutton. Daniel's pulse quickened, though his face did not change. Say it. Victor Hale. Her voice was barely audible. He came to me 2 nights before it happened. Said Sutton owed him for a shipment of opium gone missing. I thought it was just talk, but then I saw him in the alley behind Sutton's shop the night of the murder. He saw me, Daniel. And now, she swallowed hard, he sent a note, said if I speak, my family will hang in our parlor before dawn. The candle between them guttered, throwing her face into a shifting mask of fear. You came to tell me this, but you won't tell them? Daniel asked. She looked away, shame shadowing her features. I can't. I'm sorry. I couldn't let you die without knowing the truth. For a long moment, silence filled the cell. Then Daniel leaned forward, his voice low but steady. Clara, you can speak tomorrow, in court, in front of all of them. That's the only way. Her eyes filled with tears. You don't understand. I do. His tone was sharper now. You think silence will keep you safe. It won't. Hale will come for you anyway. Men like him don't leave loose threads. Her lips trembled, but she said nothing more. When the guard returned, she pulled her hood up and slipped away into the dark corridor, leaving Daniel alone with the damp and the drip of unseen water. The morning of the hearing dawned cold, the fog so thick that the courthouse seemed to float in it, its stone steps vanishing into white. The townsfolk gathered early, drawn by the scent of blood in the air. Daniel was brought in, shackled, escorted by two guards who flanked him like vultures. He scanned the crowd, faces he'd known all his life now twisted with curiosity, contempt, and that strange hunger people have when they believe they are about to witness justice. Clara sat near the front, her cloak wrapped tight around her, her gaze fixed on the floor. Victor Hale was not present, but Daniel could feel him in the room all the same, like a shadow just beyond the reach of the lamplight. The magistrate called Clara to the stand. The room hushed. Daniel watched her walk forward, each step measured, her shoulders drawn in, as though trying to make herself smaller. She took the oath with a hand that shook visibly. The magistrate asked the question, "Did you witness Daniel Cross murder Harold Sutton?" The world seemed to slow. Daniel held her eyes. In that instant, he saw every shared moment of their past. Laughter in the orchard as children whispered confessions on rainy nights, the quiet trust between them, and then, just as quickly, it was gone. "Yes," Clara said. Her voice was thin but clear enough to carry through the chamber. "I saw him stab Harold Sutton." The crowd erupted, gasps, murmurs, a few triumphant shouts. The magistrate's gavel cracked down like a gunshot, calling for order. Daniel felt nothing, no rage, no shock, only an icy stillness, as though the beating of his heart had slowed to match the measured tick of a clock. He studied Clara's face, pale, strained, the barest flicker of regret in her eyes, and he knew she had just signed her own fate. The magistrate did not deliberate long. The evidence, the witness testimony, the circumstances, all point to the guilt of Daniel Cross. The sentence of death by hanging stands. The execution will be carried out at once in the square. At once. The words moved through the room like a knife. Daniel was led outside into the thickening fog, the crowd following, their breath clouding in the cold air. The gallows loomed ahead, black against the gray sky. The rope hung ready, swaying slightly in the breeze. They placed him on the platform. The noose slipped over his head, the coarse fibers brushing his neck. The executioner stepped back, one hand on the lever, and then a sharp, hissing sound cut through the air. The rope jerked violently, snapping just above the knot. A second later, the thunk of a crossbow bolt embedding itself in the wooden beam echoed across the square. Shouts erupted. The crowd scattered in panic, the fog swallowing them. In the chaos, Daniel felt the hands on his arms loosen. He dropped to the platform, rolled to the side, and vanished into the whiteness. By the time the guards regrouped, there was no sign of him. Only the fog, curling and shifting, as though hiding something it did not intend to give back. Part 3. Deadly Reckoning. The fog in Blackridge had always been a constant presence, but in the weeks after Daniel Cross's escape, it seemed to grow heavier, more oppressive, as though the town itself was holding its breath. People spoke of shadows moving where no light fell, of footsteps echoing in empty streets, of a figure glimpsed briefly before dissolving into mist. Some said Daniel had fled the country. Others swore they saw him standing at the edge of the market square at dawn, watching, before vanishing into the alleys. But the ones who had condemned him, they didn't wonder where he was. They feared they already knew. The first death sheriff, Edwin Kane, prided himself on his composure. He was not a man to scare easily, nor did he waste time on superstition. But on the third Thursday after the failed execution, he found himself locking the door to his office earlier than usual. The fog had crept in thick through the streets that night, and for the first time in years, Kane thought he heard footsteps behind him on his walk home. He dismissed it at first, but the sound persisted, slow, measured, keeping pace with his own. When he stopped, it stopped. By the time he reached his townhouse, a fine sheen of sweat had gathered along his hairline. He stepped inside, bolted the door, and poured himself a brandy. The fire was already lit, but its warmth did little to push away the unease crawling over him. He had just raised the glass when he noticed something on his desk. It hadn't been there when he left that morning. A small brass gear, no bigger than a coin, gleaming faintly in the firelight. Kane frowned, stepping closer. The teeth of the gear were sharp, sharper than any clock piece he'd ever seen. His blood ran cold. Before he could move, the study door closed behind him with a quiet click. "I told you," came a voice from the shadows, calm and steady. "I didn't kill Harold Sutton." Kane turned, and Daniel was there, dressed in dark wool, the hood of his coat pulled low. His eyes, once unremarkable, now held a stillness so absolute it was almost inhuman. "You should have spoken the truth," Daniel continued, "but you took the coin instead." Kane's hand went for the revolver at his belt, but the click of its hammer never came. The weapon fell apart in his grip, the screws missing, the barrel loose. Daniel stepped closer, the faint metallic scent of oil and brass following him. "This is how I work, Sheriff, piece by piece, until there's nothing left." When the housemaid found Kane the next morning, he was slumped over his desk, eyes wide, throat pierced clean through by the sharpened gear. The only other thing in the room was a stopped pocket watch, its hands frozen at the hour of his death. Clara's last night. Clara Whitmore had not slept well since the trial. Every creak of her old house made her sit up in bed. Every passing shadow behind the curtains made her heart pound. She told herself Daniel was gone, across the sea, perhaps, or hiding in the northern hills. But deep down she knew. On the night he came for her, the fog was so dense it pressed against her windows like a living thing. She woke to a sound she could not place, a faint, deliberate tick, tick, tick that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. She lit a candle and saw him standing in the corner of her bedroom. Her breath caught in her throat. "Daniel, Clara," he said, and her name in his mouth was neither gentle nor cruel, simply final. She rose from the bed, the candle trembling in her hand. "I didn't want to. You lied. You chose him over me." Tears welled in her eyes. "He would have killed my family." "Do you think I won't?" The words were soft, but they cut like ice. "The moment you spoke in that court, Clara, you killed me. They just didn't finish the work." Her knees weakened, the candle sputtering in the draft. "I loved you once." Daniel's gaze didn't change. "Then you should have stood beside me." The blade he carried was small, the kind a craftsman might use to trim fine leather. It caught the candlelight once before the room went dark. In the morning, neighbors found Clara's door open, the fog lingering thick inside. On her nightstand lay a stopped pocket watch, its hands pointing to midnight. The final confrontation. Victor Hale was not a man easily cornered, but he was also not a fool. When Kane died, he doubled his guards. When Clara's body was found, he stopped appearing in public altogether. He conducted his business from the safety of his mansion on the hill, a sprawling stone estate with iron gates and a view of the entire town below. But the fog did not respect gates. On the night Daniel came, the guards outside heard nothing. One moment they were at their posts, the next they were lying unconscious in the wet grass. The locks on the gates sprung open with a precision only a master craftsman could manage. Victor was in his study, going over ledgers by candlelight, when the flame flickered and went out. He reached for the matches and froze at the sound of a voice in the dark. "You killed Sutton. You framed me. You thought you could pay your way out of the truth." Victor's hand moved toward the pistol in his desk, but when he pulled the drawer open, it was empty. Daniel stepped into the faint moonlight seeping through the curtains. "The sheriff is gone. Clara is gone. There's only you left." Victor forced a laugh, though his voice was tight. "You think killing me will change what happened?" Daniel tilted his head, considering. "No, but it will end it." The struggle was brief. Victor was strong, but Daniel moved with the quiet efficiency of a man dismantling a mechanism, each motion deliberate, each strike precise. When it was over, Victor lay slumped in his chair, a brass gear clenched in his dead hand, his eyes staring toward the window as though trying to see beyond the fog. Daniel stood over him for a long moment, then turned to the window. Blackridge lay below, silent, its street swallowed in white. He did not smile. He did not sigh in relief. He simply stepped into the mist, his form dissolving until there was nothing left but the sound of a distant tick, tick, tick. And in the years to come, when the fog was thickest, the people of Blackridge would swear they still heard it, the steady, cold heartbeat of a man who had been unjustly condemned and who had taken back his life one death at a time.